The question really is what beyond the discussion of a 30-day ceasefire has substantively been discussed with Ukrainians, perhaps even agreed, though according to the Ukrainian response is nothing. Now, what I mean by that is there isn't going to be a ceasefire just standing alone. Why would there be? The Russians will not accept that. They have the military momentum, and they've not heard a word officially from the Ukrainian side about any of the fundamental causes of the war. And that's what the Russians say, but it's true. Also, it's not just a Russian position. This war has to be ended on political grounds, the most fundamental of which include three items: Ukrainian neutrality versus the ongoing demand by Ukraine and by many of Ukraine's partners in Europe for NATO membership. The second is a settlement on territorial issues. And the third is a settlement on some kind of security arrangements in the context of a peace agreement. Now, we haven't heard publicly any movement by the Ukrainian government on any of those three items. According to the Ukrainian government, from what I've heard, and I may have missed something, but the demand for NATO membership continues essentially, or continues to this day. The demand for a full recovery of all territories to the 1991 borders continues to be the official position. And regarding security, basically NATO membership or NATO troops continue to be, including the participation of the United States, continue to be position regarding security. Now, those are not the basis for peace, because Russia has security interests that are fundamental that led to this war. Russia has the momentum on the battlefield. So calling for a 30-day ceasefire by itself means nothing. Now, presumably, when the United States representatives and the Ukrainian representatives met in Jeddah, they didn't spend 8.5 hours behind closed doors discussing a very short statement. They discussed these basic conditions. One might suspect that there was some movement on these. The United States has more or less made a very major movement on these, saying that yes, NATO will not enlarge. There will have to be territorial concessions. There will have to be security arrangements that do not include, for example, the United States. Ukraine, to my knowledge, to the time that we speak, has not made any public movement on these, and we don't know if there was private movement. Now, after that 8.5 hour meeting in Jeddah, the U.S. envoy, Steve Witkoff, met with President Putin. It was one could say, a congenial meeting. In a way, the meeting itself was mutually respectful and diplomatic. The statements that came out of it were the same. Russia saying, yes, we could agree with a ceasefire if the fundamental causes of this war are recognized. There was a further exchange regarding Ukrainian troops surrounded in the Kursk region. In the 2 days that followed, there were upbeat statements by President Trump on his social media. Presumably, something's happening behind the scenes, but we don't know. And the statements coming from European leaders are as bellicose as ever. So we have probably two levels of diplomacy taking place, something behind closed doors, something in public. If the only thing we have is the United States essentially saying NATO will not enlarge, that there need to be territorial concessions, and that a security arrangement will not involve the United States, there is no agreement on those fundamental issues, either by Ukraine or by major European powers, then I think what we will have is the United States just extricating itself from this conflict, and events will follow on. In Ukraine, probably Ukraine's major losses on the battlefield. But if there is behind closed doors more agreement, which I think is quite plausible, then maybe we're heading towards a real agreement. First, let me say what Starmer and Macron say absolutely no sense to me at all. The British almost never make any sense to me anyway, I have to say, in everything that they say, because the bellicosity, the Russophobia, the lack of any sense of diplomacy, it has 200 years of history, and it's very sad and unrealistic. But in terms of an expression of what's actually happening, it's delusional. The idea that Trump made a take it or leave it offer and that the U.S. was going to, quote, rejoin the war is completely delusional. Trump and the United States are not going to rejoin the war with new packages of military aid and an extended war in Ukraine. The United States, in its current political, fiscal, military, geopolitical conditions, is not going to do that. Why the Europeans believe that, I don't know if they believe that. Why they express that in public is beyond me, because being wrong all the time, as the British and the French are, does not seem to me to be clever bargaining, clever negotiating, clever politics. So I view it as incompetence and intransigence rather than actually even tactical, much less strategic insight on their side. Of course, everything I'm saying could be wrong. The United States could announce, Russia is not moving, so we rejoin the war. I find it impossible in the context of American politics and American interests and Trump's own position and the repeated positions of all those around him to believe that anything like that is remotely the case. So let me start there. I don't give any credence whatsoever to the British and French positions. And I've heard privately from European leaders to the contrary. So let me just add that as well. When it comes to the actual conditions for peace, I do believe the NATO question is a sine qua non. The NATO question is, in my view, the fundamental casus belli. It goes back 30 years. It's not a secret. Many times, Western officials have expressed the truth about this. Trump has said the truth about this. U.S. officials have said Ukraine is not joining NATO. Period. Everybody needs to understand this. It's not going to happen. Whether NATO survives is yet another matter, by the way. It's not beyond thinking that 10 years from now there's no NATO. But given that, Ukraine is not joining NATO. Okay, next. What about territory? Well, Crimea is not going back to Ukraine. It was part of Russia for centuries until a rather arbitrary maneuver when Crimea was gifted, so-called, to an administrative part of the Soviet Union, that is the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, in 1954 on an occasion of the 300th year celebration of a treaty which had made according to the Russian view of it, Ukraine subordinate to the Russian Empire back in 1654. Okay. Ukraine, for countless reasons, Crimea is not going back to Ukraine, period. Then come the questions of the annexed regions of the two Donbass oblasts and Zaporizhia and Kherson. I don't think that there's all that much room for maneuver and negotiating myself, because Russia won on the battlefield. If this had been the Istanbul process in April 2022, No, those would not have become Russian territory, most likely. There would have been the implementation of the Minsk II agreements in the Donbass, and the questions of Zaporizhia and Kherson never would have come up. The Western side, led by Biden, was stupid. They were stupid to block the Istanbul process, which would have ended this conflict in April 2022. Now events have continued. Well, the negotiations are all the harder on territory. Ukraine will have to cede a lot of territory. I'm not in the negotiating room, and I'm not going to negotiate in this way. I'm just saying that the events on the ground since the Istanbul process have changed for the worse regarding Ukraine's territorial situation. And that's predictably so, and I and you and others predicted it. So this is sad. If you play a losing hand and you keep upping the ante, you lose more in the end. And that's what happened to Ukraine. And that was the fault of Biden and the European leaders, but especially the Biden administration and Boris Johnson, who was leading the UK in April 2022 and went personally to Kyiv to tell them, fight on, don't take an agreement, which was in reach. When it comes to the security arrangements, the central issue on the security arrangements include two questions. What kind of military situation? Who does or doesn't have troops on the ground? How big are the militaries and so forth in Ukraine? And second, what is Russia's role in the security arrangements? Russia has said, we will not be a bystander to the security arrangements, because then you make a pretext and we're back to war. And on the other hand, European powers are saying this can't be an empty word of unilateral Ukrainian demilitarization. There needs to be something more than that. My own view, which I've put forward for many years, is that this should come under the context of the UN Security Council, which would automatically include Russia, but then automatically, of course, also importantly include China, which is a major stabilizing force for an agreement, because China will want to see an agreement fulfilled. And it, of course, includes Britain, France, and the U.S. And so the Security Council is a good venue for putting in place the security agreements. And often there are Security Council plus other co-guarantor parties to a security agreement, and that's where this should be negotiated. I personally find the April 15, 2022 nearly finalized draft of the Istanbul Agreement or the Istanbul process to be a basis for peace. Basically, the two sides were going to reach peace had the Biden administration not intervened to continue the war. And therefore, all of these issues that we're talking about, permanent neutrality or non-NATO enlargement, the territorial issues, and the security issues were nearly nailed down. Had there been an interest in peace by the U.S. administration, those remaining issues would have been settled through diplomacy, not cast aside as they were by continued war. So we know that we're not far away, except in unbelievably heated and often obtuse rhetoric, and in terms of the unilateralism of Macron and Starmer egging on the European side. It's said, by the way, I've heard it several times. I think perhaps it's said often in France, well, Macron tried and he was rebuffed, and so why should he try again? This idea of how history unfolded and how negotiations go is so primitive that you wouldn't expect a 12-year-old to use that kind of logic. But this is actually the logic. He was rebuffed. He was insulted. He was humiliated. Give me a break. Are you kidding? Would you sit down and negotiate a serious arrangement? This is my advice. We are not in a bilateral negotiation. People forget that. completely. People think that this is somehow a bilateral negotiation between Russia and Ukraine. It's nothing of the sort. We are in a completely interconnected world where this war impacts the entire world, and where Russia has global interests, the United States has global interests, Europe has global interests. If you vulgarly cheat on an agreement that you've made to the whole world through the UN, and specifically the UN Security Council, the consequences are quite different from what you would have in a bilateral situation where one side cheats on the other, but there's no recourse to third parties. This is the idea, by the way, of law itself, that you don't have vendettas and revenge matches between two sides. You multilateralize it. You put it in a context where there are broader interests at stake. This is very, very basic. It's a very basic concept of diplomacy. Treaties are not bilateral documents if they're properly drawn, and flagrant violations of treaties that are agreed and systematically monitored and well designed impose high costs on the violators. And so the idea that is very often stated in Europe these days, well, we could agree on something, but then Putin will just cheat and continue, is extraordinarily naive. And by the way, since everything in discourse goes back to someone's historical example, and typically to Munich in the fall of 1938, it should be said very explicitly that agreement that was reached between Hitler and Chamberlain, when Hitler vulgarly violated it, soon afterwards had massive repercussions against Germany, including the massive accelerated rearmament of Britain, including uniting much of the world against Hitler, including exposing Hitler to the lies, including the ability of the United States to enter into many agreements even before entering into the war itself in December 1941, including enabling Churchill to face down those who would compromise with Hitler in May of 1940 by saying Hitler cannot be trusted to make an agreement. So even the most famous case that Europeans look to of saying we can't deal with the other side, Munich 1938, appeasement of Hitler, historians that are serious historians know, first of all, Hitler felt that he had been tricked into that agreement because it did expose his hand. It did change his timing. It did weaken his position. It did lead ultimately to his defeat. That's not the history we tell now. The history that is told in the tabloids is never negotiate with the other side. Well, I would say two things. One, this is not Munich 1938. There's none of the preceding history. There's none of the contextual situation. The whole analogy is pathetically weak, and we've been making that phony analogy through every war the United States has been in for 50 years, whether it's Iraq or whether it's any other place. So it's false. But even if it were a serious analogy, it's a completely misunderstood historical event. And so I would just say my bottom line is treaties are important. They can work. They need to be properly drafted. They need to be properly monitored. They need to be understood for what they are, which is to multilateralize a crisis, not to bilateralize an ongoing crisis. NATO lost its purpose in 1990. The Warsaw Pact was ended. NATO should have been ended. NATO certainly lost its purpose in December 1991. The Soviet Union was dismembered. I happened to be around those days rather intensively. There was no risk whatsoever of any kind of a Russian invasion of Europe. NATO should have been ended then. It became something completely different from a defense against a Soviet invasion. It became the instrument in Western Eurasia for the American hegemonic project. This was not NATO's purpose up until 1990. NATO's purpose, whatever one thinks, was to face off against the Soviet Union in Western Europe. But it became, as an expansionary organization, precisely and explicitly part of the American unipolarity and American hegemony and American police enforcement powers. And it was used in this way repeatedly. So I think that NATO has been misguided for more than 30 years. Right now, it's fraught with problems. One is the United States, rightly, under Donald Trump, is saying, well, those 30 years of adventurism, of expansion are over. They failed. They were dangerous. They were costly. We're not doing it anymore. The Europeans are supposedly in panic over this, but they should get a grip and understand what's been said. The United States did not say NATO is over. The United States said NATO will not expand further. So this is one big point. Trump is also saying a second point, which is Europe has to spend more on its own defense. By the way, I favor a European common defense. This is the right approach. That may mean another percentage point of GDP in spending. I don't think it's 5% of GDP. That's if you're going to war, but no one should go to war. A proper deterrence and a proper military force in Europe might be 3% of GDP right now. Okay, that's fine. Do it. But that's different from NATO. Will NATO, in the form of Article 5, guarantees that the United States would swoop in to a European war, still apply? Well, this is where I say in 10 years we may not have NATO. If the Europeans act as stupidly as their leaders are speaking right now, NATO will end. If Starmer and Macron continue to beat the war drums and actually perhaps even mean it, that they're going to unilaterally place troops on the ground in Ukraine, this would accelerate the end of NATO, because the United States political scene and public will not say, my God, they had a chance for peace, but they went to war and we're supposed to defend them if they're attacked in return. No way. The United States absolutely would lose interest because the U.S. doesn't want to get into World War III. So if Starmer and Macron persist in the way they're persisting right now, they're accelerating the end of NATO. Now, one could say, oh, that's their Machiavellian plot. I don't think so. I don't think there's anything clever about what they're doing. But that is the inadvertent result of their actions. Twice in the last week, I heard, once from an official, once from a senior thinker in Europe, the statement, oh, Jeff, why do you take these protestations of NATO enlargement so seriously? We know that NATO's not going to enlarge to Ukraine. I heard this twice in the last week. I went back and looked at, there are no doubt dozens. I collected around 20 very high-level statements in recent months where solemnly it was stated that NATO will expand to Ukraine. So, according to 2 times what I heard last week, the public statements are just lies, and that private statements are very different. I asked both times, what's the purpose of this public lying? This is a degradation of democracy and very dangerous in my view. I feel I did not hear a good answer to this. Is this Europeans cleverly stirring up fear to raise the defense budget? Is it Europeans trying to become heroic figures because they lack public support in their countries? Is it laziness because we have Article 10 of the NATO treaty which claims an open door so no one can say otherwise. Is it naivete? To my mind, it's lying. It is in private, they say one thing, and in public, they say another thing. This kind of lying can get us all killed, as far as I'm concerned. Leaders should tell the truth. Really. I'm not talking about a tactical military maneuver from morning till afternoon. I'm talking about high policy that's stated and restated and restated. If they believe privately something different from what they're saying in public, they need absolutely to stop the lying. If they really believe that NATO will enlarge, they need to get their heads examined, frankly, because they don't understand anything that's going on. My take is that they're lying. And I am aware that politicians lie, but lying on something of such gravity and consequence and so repeatedly over a period of decades, and even in the context of war and risk of nuclear war, is unacceptable.